Chapter 42. Elves and Harpies. Almost as one man, the 5 elven archers strung arrows to their bows and fired. Their arrows traced graceful arcs across the drill ground. Lagnoth, Nidda, and Limgag all took to the air the instant the elves fired, managing to get clear of the immediate danger zone. Reyes and Betrag also tried to gain height by launching themselves into the air, but neither of them was quite so lucky. The elven arrow struck down with murderous intent. Betrag was killed instantly. She was struck once in the left eye and again in her left wing. She dropped like a stone. Reyes was also struck twice. One of the arrows hit her in the right leg just above the knee, while a second arrow penetrated right through her left wing, forcing her out of the air. Reyes tried to return fire. Her position made the shot awkward. She couldn't even stand up because her leg wound prevented her from putting any weight on her right side. From a seated position, she fired a dart at the elven archers. The dart was fast, but Reyes' aim was off, and the dart shot past all 5 elves harmlessly. It struck amongst the dull blue-clad bodyguards the Emperor had brought with him, penetrating one of their shields, but not striking the elf behind. Lagnoth was shaking her head sadly. Reyes is a sitting duck. Lagnoth and Nidda both concentrated on gaining height rather than shooting back. Limgag, on the other hand, tried to meld the two actions. She fired an arrow as she continued to climb. It had to have been a lucky shot. Her arrow was straight and true, and it struck one of the elves in the centre of his breastplate where it lodged harmlessly. Reyes blinked, disbelieving. It was true that Limgag was still quite young, and perhaps hadn't reached the full potential of her Harpy's strength. Then again, Gaggara was younger still, and an arrow from her would easily have penetrated right through a breastplate like those that the elven archers were wearing. Reyes could come to only one conclusion. Those elves are wearing enchanted armour. One of the 5 elves broke rank. He strung an arrow to his bow and walked almost casually over to where Reyes was sitting. Reyes saw him approach, and in virtual panic tried to prepare another dart for firing. She fumbled to set it properly on the string. As fast as she was far too slow. The elf took his time. He raised his bow slowly and deliberately, and he fired at what was effectively point-blank range. The elf's arrow struck the harpy at about the area of her heart. She slumped back against the floor of the drill ground and didn't move again. He executed her, Reyes said, shocked. Lagnoth just looked at him and bowed her head in confirmation. The other 4 elves were also preparing to fire. They took aim at the fast-climbing Lagnoth and Nidda, evidently wanting to hit them before the pair got out of range. Lagnoth fired first. She aimed at the head of one of the elves. This would normally be a very difficult shot, perhaps even next to impossible considering how fast she was climbing. With the bracelets, though, her aim was true. The dart sped down, striking her target squarely in the head. It penetrated his helmet and quite a bit of the rest of his body. The elf collapsed in a crumpled heap. Reyes smiled grimly to himself. His bracelets were working. What was more, it looked as if only the breastplates of the archers were enchanted. The elves might as well have not been wearing helmets for all the good they would do them. Then the elves returned fire. Lagnoth received a small graze to her foot, while Nidda went spiralling to the ground as 2 arrows pierced her wings. She hit the ground hard and heavy. There was no sign of movement from her. The elf that had killed Reyes was also ready for another shot. He aimed straight up at Limgag. Limgag fired first. She wasn't known for her skill with a bow, but under pressure, in the middle of battle, it was as if she was some kind of savant. It may just have been another lucky shot, but the elf was hit in the middle of his face and toppled over backwards to lay dead sprawled across the body of Reyes. Then the remaining 3 elves all targeted Limgag. By now, Lagnoth had flown so high that she had to be virtually out of range of their arrows. Reyes could almost feel himself breathing easily. His girlfriend wasn't about to lose her mother after all. He was feeling very concerned about Limgag, though. Reyes was right to feel concerned. Limgag did her best to claim more height, but the elves all fired, and a moment later Limgag was dropping out of the sky with 3 arrows protruding from her chest. Lagnoth sighed. I guess I'll need to find you someone to replace Limgag on your next hunt. Reyes looked a little shocked as he turned to look at Lagnoth. He thought he knew Lagnoth, and he couldn't believe that she would be so cold about the deaths of those in her charge. That's 1 for you, 2 for Lofgren, and 1 for Tafgir, Lagnoth muttered. She sounded as emotional as an accountant calculating her losses. She even kept her attention on the battle as she spoke. Reyes turned his attention back to the fighting. They might have lost 4 friends today, but at least Lagnoth should be safe. Lagnoth had stopped climbing. She had been flying virtually straight up since the battle had started and was likely feeling quite tired. Reyes estimated that she must have climbed to an altitude of at least 1,000 feet. She definitely seemed to think that she was beyond the range of the elven arrows. She just hovered there, took careful aim, and fired. The 3 elves scattered, running as far as they could to the edges of the drill ground, and as far from where they had been standing as they could. The magic of the bracelets caused the dart to change direction in mid-flight, and like a guided missile it sought out the elf that Lagnoth had targeted. And then there were 2. Reyes almost got the feeling that Lagnoth was enjoying herself now. She was safe, she could take her time, and she intended to make the remaining 2 elves suffer as they waited for death. Lagnoth attached another dart to the string of her dart thrower and pulled back the string. Even from this far away, Reyes could hear the distinctive sound of wood cracking. The weapons used by the soldiers of the Hope weren't usually all that good, and the dart thrower Lagnoth had been given must have been warped in some way, for it had broken at a very vital moment. Reyes felt his heart sink as the broken dart thrower hit the dirt of the Hope's drill ground a couple of seconds later. Lagnoth would still have the darts though. Reyes stood there, thinking that the bracelet should still help her if she just threw the darts at the elves. Keeping his eyes on Lagnoth, and no doubt trying to anticipate the next attack, one of the remaining elves made the mistake of moving too close to what he thought was the dead body of Nida. Nida suddenly sprang into life. She grabbed him from behind, and snarling like some sort of wild animal leaped on his back, and all but ripped his head off. "Nida's still alive," Reyes stated excitedly. The last archer turned his attention to Nida. He already had an arrow strung to his bow, and it was a simple matter to shoot her before she closed the short gap that lay between them. Nida was struck in the abdomen. She fell backwards onto the floor, her groans making it clear that even now she was still alive. The elf quickly turned his attention back to Lagnoth. After all, he could finish Nida any time, but Lagnoth was an immediate threat. He began to string another arrow to his bow as quickly as he could. In the meantime, either Lagnoth had decided not to throw the darts, or maybe it simply hadn't occurred to her that she could. Instead, she had taken the opportunity of the elf being distracted by Nida in order to dive bomb him. For all his training as a soldier of the palace guards, the final elf was clearly in a panic as he fumbled with his arrow. Lagnoth reached him. She grabbed his bow with her left hand as she went in with her claws from the right. There was a sickening clang as Lagnoth's claws failed to penetrate the elf's enchanted armour. The blow still caused the elf to stagger back a couple of steps. He drew a small dagger as he did so. From the look in his eyes, though, it was clear he didn't rate his chances all that high. Lagnoth whacked at the elf about the head with his own bow, and then, as the elf fell to the ground, she put her foot over the elf's face and pressed down hard until she heard a satisfying crack. The final elf was dead. Lagnoth took a step back from the elf and staggered slowly over to where Nida was lying. It was clear she was exhausted. No one else moved. Reyes wanted to go and check that Lagnoth was all right, and he was sure that Gaggara did too, but he also wanted to see if he could do anything to help Nida. But no one else was moving. The Emperor was still there, and no one was daring to move. Is that it?" the Emperor said. From the sound of his voice, he wasn't too impressed. Lagnoth wasn't finished, though. There was an almost animalistic gleam in her eyes, a lust for blood and revenge. As she staggered over to where Nida lay, she snapped the elf's longbow in twain and let the pieces drop to the ground. Then she bent down next to Nida, as if she planned to render aid to the dying Harpy, but instead she took hold of Nida's bow and one of her arrows. There was a moment of hush and confusion as Lagnoth strung the arrow to Nida's bow. Even now she played it as if she was just going to put Nida out of her misery. Instead, Lagnoth turned suddenly to aim towards the palanquin. She fired at the fat Emperor. The arrow flew straight and true, with the magic of the bracelets aiding her aim. There could be no doubt that Lagnoth's arrow would have hit the Emperor had his palanquin not been surrounded by a magical protective shield. The arrow melted the second it struck the barrier, and dissipated into the air like steam. "Kill her," the Emperor ordered angrily. Dharti nodded once. To all who were there, it looked as if Dharti did no more than just look at Lagnoth. He didn't even raise a finger. There were no words, no gestures, not even the apparent focusing of magic. There was nothing to suggest that Dharti had even cast a spell. Lagnoth collapsed to the ground. She wasn't even moving. No, Mother! Reyes could hear Gaggara screaming from all the way across the compound. Even now, though, Gaggara didn't run onto the drill ground. Somewhere close to him, Lagnoth sighed loudly. I suppose that's 2 for you, 2 for Lofgren, and 1 for Tafgir. Reyes still wasn't sure he could believe his ears. Lagnoth was still talking as if those who had died on the drill ground today were nothing more than lost assets. Lagnoth had been one of Lagnoth's closest friends, and yet he was acting as if Lagnoth's death was no more than a minor inconvenience. Reyes found it hard to imagine how anyone could be so cold under the circumstances. Happy, my liege? The Major Advisor asked his Emperor. My liege, the parrot repeated. The Emperor reported. I was hoping for a little more excitement than that. Let's try something else. I think we should pitch a group of 5 Minotaurs against an equal number of... Please, my liege, Dharti implored the Emperor. If you keep this up, you will alienate the entire regiment, not to mention that you'll kill all of our troops before we even get them to the field. I've told you before, the Emperor expounded. I'm the Emperor, the Dragon Emperor. I'm in charge. These soldiers are just slaves to the Empire. I will do with them as I please. Suddenly, everything went very silent. It wasn't simply a case that the spell amplifying the Emperor's voice had run out. Reyes couldn't hear anything. Not a bird in the sky, or the movement of nearby soldiers. He couldn't even hear his own breathing. It was as if a cloak of silence had suddenly been cast across the entire compound. Dharti was saying something to the Emperor. Obviously the Emperor could hear what was being said, because his face was turning red as if with anger, or maybe, though Reyes found it hard to believe, with fear. Then Dharti took a step back from the palanquin. He bowed just slightly to the Emperor, and as suddenly as it had appeared, the cloak of silence was abruptly lifted. The Emperor spoke, his voice amplified again. He sounded reluctant as he said, very well. Let's move on to the next regiment. Maybe we'll find some better sport there. As you wish, my liege, Dharti responded. He and the Emperor exchanged meaningful glances as if agreeing upon an unspoken truth. Just like that, the visit was over. Slowly the Emperor and his entourage began to file out of the compound, leaving in the same order as they had come. Not one of them showed even the slightest bit of concern for the 5 soldiers they were leaving behind on the Hope's drill ground. Once the visitors had left the compound, the soldiers of the Hope began to flood back onto the drill ground. Gaggara led the way. She ran, seeming to forget for a moment that she had wings. She settled down by her mother, took her mother's head in her arms, and all but screamed at her inability to cry properly. Some of the others were doing their best to console Gaggara. This seemed an impossible task, because any time someone tried to get close to her, Gaggara would scream at them to leave her and her mother alone. Lying nearby, on another part of the field, one of the elves had somehow managed to survive the battle. He was very badly wounded. Reyes reckoned that the elf's neck and spine were broken, but somehow he was still alive. It was unlikely he would remain so for long. A group of soldiers of the Hope, though strangely none of them Harpies, had taken it upon themselves to kick him to death. Looks as if they killed our gate guards too, Lagnoth muttered. Reyes looked across the drill ground to the gates. The 2 goblins that had been on duty were both lying still on the ground. Reyes shook his head sadly. They had been on duty, doing their job, and they had been cut down for no better reason than to amuse the Emperor. Reyes thought he could guess who was responsible. It would have been the 2 golden boys. Those boys might look harmless enough, but sometimes they seemed to thrive on death, and besides, Reyes couldn't imagine that any of the soldiers would have struck them down, at least not without an order to do so. I really hate this place sometimes, Lagnoth commented. Every time we receive a visitor, we end up with a few less soldiers. The last time it was the Inquisitors and a few humans. I guess we can live without humans, but this time they killed Harpies, and I am not happy. Sometimes I think about just packing my things and leaving the Hope. Maybe finding a village. I'm only 14. I'm sure some male would be glad to accept me into his fold. Finally, Reyes thought, a little bit of emotion from Lagnoth. I'd better go, he told her. Maybe I can do something to help. Lagnoth nodded. I'll come with you. Reyes got to Gaggara's side as quickly as his legs would carry him. He knelt down beside her and began to examine Lagnoth's body, hoping against hope that maybe she was only unconscious. There wasn't a mark on her. Well, perhaps a slight bruise near her heart, but it was hard to tell. Regardless, Lagnoth was clearly dead. I'm sorry, Reyes said to Gaggara, stroking her shoulder gently. Get off me! Gaggara screamed at him. She brushed him forcefully away. Then she seemed to realise whom she had spoken to and grabbed him tightly. "I'm sorry, don't go. I didn't realise it was you." Reyes kissed her gently on the head and assured her, "It's okay. I know you're emotional. I know how I'd feel if my mother was killed in front of me." "Do you still remember your mother, handsome?" Gaggara asked. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder. "In a manner of speaking," Reyes replied. He put an arm around her and hugged her tightly. He hated to break free of her, but Lagnoth hadn't been the only Harpy to get shot today, and at least one of the others, Nida, was still alive. Reyes was sure he could help her. He let go of Gaggara and tried to stand. "Why?" Gaggara said, pulling him back down into her grip. "Why would the Emperor do this?" "It's in her nature." It was Agnar who spoke. She was standing just over the two. "I hate her," Gaggara screamed loudly. She didn't seem to care who might overhear. "I want her dead." "You wouldn't be the first," Reyes told her. He kissed her gently on the temple and broke away from her. "I need to go and check the others, love. I'll be back once I'm done." Gaggara screamed in despair and rested her head gently on her mother's chest. Nida was lying on the ground where she had fallen. There were 2 holes in her wings where arrows had struck her. A third arrow was protruding from her abdomen, where, fortunately, it didn't appear to have struck anything vital. Reyes felt himself in something of a quandary. He had no doubt that he could save Nida's life. However, doing so would expose his ability to use magic. After spending a year in the city, Reyes had done everything he could to avoid the use of magic when others were watching. Harpies just didn't use magic, and Reyes had no desire to change that misconception of his race. Indeed, even Gaggara had no idea that Reyes could cast magic. In the end, Reyes felt that he had to do everything he could to save Nida, and to hell with the consequences. "Agnar," Reyes said, "I need you to clear the area for me. Give me and Nida a little bit of room. Gaggara can stay, but I need everyone else gone. Can you do that for me?" "Why?" Agnar asked. Reyes hardly heard the question. He turned back to look at Nida, muttering, "I just wish I had my sword." Nida, who was still conscious, thought she understood Reyes' intent. "Yes," she groaned. "End it for me." Reyes nodded. "I will, Nida. I will end your pain." "Oh," Agnar commented, also seeming to understand. "I see. Well, I'm sure no one will mind watching you put Nida out of her." "Agnar, please," Reyes insisted. Okay, Agnar muttered with a sigh. Agnar was very good at enforcing her authority. A few argued that they wanted to hang around and watch, but Agnar was adamant, and even those who weren't Harpies seemed to listen to her when she gave an order. It really didn't take all that long for her to clear the immediate area. It was true that most of the soldiers didn't go all that far, but then Reyes hadn't explained to Agnar what he was planning to do. "Okay," Agnar said upon her return. "You have some space to work. Make her passing easy." "Passing?" Reyes commented to Agnar, a little confused. Then he turned to Nida and warned her, "Okay, this is gonna hurt a bit as I remove the arrow." "No," Nida pleaded. "Just end my life. I don't want to live without my wings. I don't want to live knowing I'll never fly again." "This may kill you," Reyes warned, ignoring her pleading. "If it doesn't, I think I can save your life. And with any luck, maybe your wings too." "What are you going to do?" Agnar asked. "I'm going to perform the impossible," Reyes replied calmly. "The impossible?" Agnar commented, a strange tone to her voice. "The impossible," Reyes repeated. He took a firm hold on the tail end of the arrow protruding from Nida's torso. It wasn't easy to do. The arrow was covered in blood and was quite slippery. "Ready?" "Please, just kill me," Nida whimpered with pain. Reyes shook his head, and then, with a sudden jerk, he pulled the arrow free. Nida screamed suddenly and went silent. Her head rolled to the side. "Is she?" Agnar asked. It was strange how Agnar seemed interested in Nida's health, and yet her tone suggested that she didn't really care one way or the other. Reyes put his head to Nida's chest. There was still a definite heartbeat. "She's still alive." "Now what?" Agnar asked. Then, sounding as if she was actually concerned for the wounded Nida, she said, "If only we had a healer." "Indeed," Reyes commented. "If only we had a healer." He then placed his hand flat over Nida's belly wound and concentrated. It wasn't easy to do without any focus, but his sword was long gone. He tried his best to control as much magic as he could on that one single point. The power built up slowly, making his fingers tingle. He gathered as much power as he felt capable of controlling, and then let it all go with a single trigger word. "Heal." "What?" Agnar commented. She looked at him confused. "What did you do?" Reyes removed his hands and wiped away the blood. The wound made by the arrow had all but vanished. But Agnot was stumbling for words. How? I am not without a little bit of talent, Reyes told her. He breathed deeply. The spell had tired him considerably. Now I'm going to try something I've never gotten to work before. This may take some time. Keep an eye on the holes in her wings and tell me when they're closed. Agnot didn't seem to know what to say. Just watch her wings, Reyes repeated. Reyes was too busy concentrating on trying to save Nida's life to even notice that Gaggara had approached them. She was still clearly upset as she rested her hand lightly on Reyes' shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" Her words were still very shaky. "Exactly what I appeared to be doing," Reyes told her gently. He reached up and stroked her hand with his own blood-stained digits. Gaggara didn't seem to mind. "I'm afraid this is quite likely not to work. If it doesn't, Nida might still wish I'd just killed her." Once again, Reyes focused his power. He placed one hand on either wing and concentrated as hard as he could. The regeneration spell had never worked properly for him back at the castle. Somehow he had never been able to hold his concentration for long enough. However, there was an important difference between doing something for practice and doing it because someone needed help. "They're gone," Agnot suddenly said, astounded. "What?" Reyes said, shocked. It was sooner than he had expected. He was sure he must have screwed something up, and yet, when he looked down, the only thing wrong with Nida's wings were the bloody handprints covering them. Reyes allowed the energy to dissipate. He realised he had also been holding his breath and let it go. It almost looked like magic," Gaggara said. The shock of seeing Reyes perform a spell seemed to have pulled Gaggara free of her melancholy. "It is magic," Agnot confirmed. "It must be. But Harpies can't use magic. That's just the stuff of fairy tales," Gaggara uttered. "It's simply not possible." "The evidence would say otherwise," Agnot said. "You are one very talented Harpy. You know, I've not heard of someone with your skills since the days of Lammerwalt the Eternal. I might almost think you were she if it wasn't for one small detail." "What detail?" Reyes commented. "She was female," Agnot replied. "You clearly aren't female." Agnot made a lunge for Reyes' skirts, but Reyes knocked her hand aside. Agnot didn't try a second time. "As I said," Gaggara muttered, "fairy tales." "There is a lot of truth in certain fairy tales," Agnot was saying. "Actually, I've heard of one other case, though it was pure hearsay, rather than something I can actually claim to experience for myself. A few years back, a girl passing through the city on her way to the mountains spread about a rumour that she had seen a Harpy who could cast magic. At the time, no one took her seriously." There was a pause, and then Agnot added, "I probably ought to report this. You're bound to get another promotion." She laughed and climbed to her feet. "One man Tanrag," she laughed again. "Now that idiot Phraign has vanished, the Hope could use a new worm man. Before long you'll be in charge of the entire regiment if this keeps up." Reyes grabbed Agnot by her wrist and said, "Please don't." He looked at the crowds of soldiers, many of them still too close for Reyes to feel comfortable. They must have seen what he had done. They had to be aware of his abilities. Even as he looked at them, he could see that some of them were discussing things with those nearest to them. Reyes could hear nothing more than a murmured hubbub of many people speaking at once, but somehow he was sure they were comparing notes on what they had just witnessed. "I'd rather as few people know about this as possible. I don't doubt that too many people are already aware of my abilities. I don't want the Inquisitors coming back to check me out again. I've kept this ability secret even from the girl I love the most, because supposedly Harpies can't cast magic, and I didn't want to come under any intense scrutiny." "I understand," Agnot grinned at him. There was something disturbing about that grin. "Besides, I'm really not all that powerful," Reyes added. "I just picked up one or two spells during my captivity." "You cast magic," Agnot commented. "That makes you powerful." Gaggara suddenly grabbed Reyes by his shoulder and started pulling him forcibly to his feet. "Come on," she pleaded. "Maybe you can do something for my mother." Reyes stood up voluntarily. He took hold of Gaggara and pulled her into his arms. There he held her comfortingly, telling her, "I wish I could. But to save a life, there must still be a life to save. I'm afraid your mother is already gone." Gaggara nodded slowly, and she seemed to lose her battle with her despair. She placed her head gently on his shoulder and held him tightly, trying to comfort herself. There had been a few moments of hope in her voice and mannerisms, and suddenly she was back to being little more than a limp doll. "Agnot," Reyes said, without letting go of Gaggara, or even turning to face the object of his comment, "I'm going to take my girlfriend back to our barracks. Could you arrange to get these bodies cleared away from the drill ground? I'd rather not risk Gaggara having to see her mother like that again. I will, Ragnar readily agreed. I'll round up some elves or goblins or something. Also, I lent a pair of bracelets to Lagnoth just before the battle, Reyes added. I'd rather she wasn't buried with them. If you could make sure they get returned to me, any time before my next hunt will do. I'll get them for you, Ragnar agreed. What should we do about Nida? She'll be fine, Reyes replied, looking over his shoulder. She's lost a lot of blood, though, so she'll need time to recover. Can you put her somewhere comfortable for a few hours? Give her a couple of days before you put her back to work again, and I bet you'll hardly be able to guess she's ever been injured. That quick? Ragnar asked. That quick, Reyes replied. Okay, I guess I can arrange something, Ragnar agreed. For a moment it looked as if she was going to say something else, but then evidently changed her mind and turned her attention back to tending Nida. Reyes untangled himself from Gaggara, and then he bent down and picked her up. She was quite light, weighing perhaps half of what a human female with her frame might have weighed. He then carried her as carefully as he could, much like a husband carrying his newlywed bride, across the threshold to the door of their barracks house. Before opening the door and stepping through, Reyes decided to take one final look at the carnage that had befallen the 421st Hope that day, and there, over by the compound gates, staggering like he was drunk, was a very confused-looking worm-man Phraign.